Good morning, everyone. Good morning to everyone in the United States. Good afternoon to our audience in Europe. My name is Damir Marušić. I am an editor at the Washington Post opinions page. Tomorrow is a big day in the Balkans, or rather, it could be a big day. Serbia's President Aleksandar Vucic and Kosovo's Prime Minister Albin Kurti are set to meet in Ohrid in North Macedonia to hammer out the implementation details of an EU-brokered and US-backed normalization proposal. Ever since the two met in Brussels last month and seemed to agree in principle on the terms of the normalization agreement, hopes for a full deal have been abnormally high, I would say, abnormally high for the Western Balkans. Part of that might be that the deal itself falls short of any kind of final agreement on mutual recognition, something which has been the end goal of the ongoing Belgrade-Pristina Dialogue process that has been going on since 2011. But maybe I think the hopes are that a less ambitious normalization proposal can be reached that delivers many meaningful ways, changes that people on the ground can feel, and which could set up the parameters for a longer term and full resolution to this lingering issue in the region. We have some really excellent intellectual firepower on the panel with us here today. Let me just introduce them very quickly before we get started. We have Veton Suroy, who really is an institution in the region. He's a writer, an editor, a former member of the Kosovo Assembly, and the founder of Kosovo's largest daily paper, Koha Editore. We have Ivan Vejvoda, who is also an institution. He is currently permanent fellow and head of Europe's futures at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and was, among many other things, an advisor to the late Serbian Prime Minister Zoran Đinđić, who was tragically assassinated 20 years ago this past week. We have Maja Piščević, is a former colleague of mine at the Atlantic Council, also very much an institution there at the Europe Center, where she's a non-resident senior fellow. She lives in Belgrade. And last but not least, we have Ambassador Cameron Munter, also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center and the Europe Center. Cameron spent 3 decades in the US Foreign Service, and he served as ambassador to Pakistan and Serbia. So he knows the region well, and he understands international diplomacy very well. Before we get started, I would like to encourage our viewers online to put questions in the Q&A function. Those will be fed to me. We'd really like to have you part of the conversation. So I will pose those questions as they come in. But let's get us started, sort of the broader discussion before we bring the audience in. Veton, let's start with you. The summit is tomorrow. I've noticed today already some articles are coming out that are maybe a little less optimistic about what will be achieved or what can be achieved. How do you see things? Are you optimistic? Will there be a breakthrough?
Well, I think the breakthrough was already made in February when President Vucic and Prime Minister Kurti agreed to the European plan, as such, the principles of the European plan. Now we are in the phase of details, and we know who resides there in the details. I think it will be a fairly difficult process ahead. I don't think expectations should be raised that there will be somehow a magic signature that will somehow put everything rolling and a quick solution to all the problems. I think what we will probably have is a rather difficult and bumpy process to reaching to an agreement of how to proceed further. Now, that said, I think the changes have been dramatic in the sense that after 10 years of rather unfruitful negotiations conducted by the EU, we are in a phase in which the great powers and the EU, within the EU and outside of the EU, have decided to put things into a more serious perspective. And that may be encouraging. Are we there yet? I'm not sure.
I mean, do you see, Veton, what do you foresee then for this actual summit? Do you feel like there's going to be the speculation I've seen in any case at this point that the even implementation details will be difficult to come by? Do you foresee that we'll have some kind of actual path forward, even if the implementation may be difficult?
We are already in, I mean, the path forward has already begun, so to speak. The question is whether it will be, or how bumpy it will be, and how much investment, political investment, both sides can afford, how much all this accumulated negative energy in our societies can be an impediment. And let's not forget, we are societies that have spent the last 20 or more years not creating a climate of peace, but actually accumulating hatred. And a very messy negotiating process in the past 10 years that has complicated things even further. So what I think will happen in the best of cases is that both parties will take out of discussion things that are not for discussion, that they both have agreed, and make a list of things that they ought to work on further. That said, the question is how much goodwill there is, and I think the test will be for both parties to manifest the goodwill to actually continue further, even if the impediments are there.
Thank you, Ivan. I think the same question to you then. How do you read the state of play right now? What are you looking for tomorrow? Any optimism?
If there's optimism, it always has to be very cautious. That's something that we've learned with the breakdown of Yugoslavia. I agree very much with what Veton has said. And I'd just like to remind us that we've been in this issue for much too long. The bombing ended more than 20 years ago. Kosovo declared independence in 2008. The Brussels Agreement was signed 10 years ago, 2013. And the famous Thessaloniki promise of the EU that we would all become members one day is 20 years old in June. The important background is that all of us, all these countries, including Kosovo and Serbia, want to become members of the European Union. So if that is a common goal, not many commonalities, but that's certainly a common goal, then we need to abide by the rules and values. And so I think this particular stage falls into that category, not forgetting that Russia and Mr. Putin invaded Ukraine, which set a whole new framework to this process, which has been rather messy, as Veton has said, over the past, if not more than 10 years. So let me say the minds are focused everywhere, and there is no time to lose, because the Russian spoiler effect in the region can only continue if we do not move forward on this issue. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a surprise tomorrow, but again, I'm holding my horses because we've been deceived too many times in the past. But if the leaderships of the two countries are serious about their European future, about wanting to help their citizens move forward, then there will be a significant step in this process that has already begun. And last but not least, I think the fully concerted effort of the United States and the European Union is a fundamental in bringing this forward and to a close more quickly than one would have assumed before the Russian aggression.
Cameron, you've been ambassador. You're residing in Prague right now, in the thick of things in Europe. Can you tell us what are the stakes for the West for getting this right? Cameron, you're muted.
have to unmute myself, excuse me. The stakes for the West are that certainly there is the habit that leaders have gotten into in recent years, which is to wait for crisis before getting ahead of the problem. And that is, I think, the risk. I think that despite what Ivan has said about the remarkable cooperation of the Americans and the Europeans, the work that Lajčák and Escobar have done together, et cetera, there is always the fact that this topic has not always been at the top of people's agendas, and it's easy to wait until things get bad. So that I think that we have an opportunity where there is enough focus, thanks also to the external developments in Ukraine, which have sharpened certainly the minds in Washington and Brussels. There's the externalities of fearing that the region could be some part of a greater global problem, China, et cetera. So that we do have the coming together that we haven't apparently had over the last decade of interest. Now, whether that is going to be enough is an important issue. And I'd like to take a little bit of a detour here to talk about what implementation really means. Let's not forget that what has happened up till now are efforts to bring the leaders together to come to a framework where they work together. But the process of negotiating peace is almost never just something that leaders do. People have to be brought along, and that will take an effort that is different than having Escobar and Lajčák simply bringing the other leaders to a table. It will involve NGOs and other groups talking to people on the ground who are going to implement the agreement. I'll use as an analogy the Good Friday Accords in Northern Ireland. There may have been agreement from the leaders, but that agreement, once the framework was established, and I'm being optimistic now that it's possible that there may be a framework established, the implementation takes place on the ground. And this is going to take a new kind of effort. It's going to take an extra stage of engagement from the United States, from the European Union, dealing with civic groups, dealing with the minorities who live in each of the different countries, dealing with public opinion, in order to make sure that the actual implementation on the ground takes place. So yes, let's hope that what we have is enough attention from the Americans, from the Europeans, that they want to make this stick. But let's also not kid ourselves that getting an agreement on paper is the same thing as coming to grips with what the implementation will require. It's going to take a lot more work, and it's going to take a lot of different work, not just shuttle diplomacy, but getting people to walk door to door in difficult neighborhoods in the region.
That's a good segue for a question I have for Maya then. Maya, in Belgrade, what is the political mood on the ground? Now, take Cameron's point that let's get the framework agreed on and some sort of, loose plan for going forward on paper. But what has the mood been so far? How has civil society in Serbia been engaging? How has the media coverage been? Are the people ready?
I think you know most of the answers to this question, Damir, but yes, I have to agree also with what Cameron said, and given his worries about the implementation, I have to say that he's probably very much right, given the situation across the media right now, which at best we can say is hectic, and it's an agony of contradictions, a lot of irrational complaints and criticizers. We hear a lot, but then what is really dangerous? We hear a lot of the words like victim and victimization, Serbia being a victim, which is known through the history that we often like to do that to ourselves. Then there's blackmail. Either Serbia is blackmailed or President Vucic is blackmailed to accept the deal. But the main word and the most scary one, which we hear a lot, is treason, and that those chains of accusations on both sides for as being traitors Also, there's an open competition on being a bigger patriot than the other side. So on one hand, there's a question, is Vucic bigger patriot for accepting the EU deal, or the bigger patriots are those who would refuse the deal at any price and at any cost? And that's really destructive. And that's the atmosphere in which we are awaiting that day tomorrow, which I agree with other panelists. We have to lower our expectations, but I think still the progress will be made, because I think that the negotiators, if nothing else, are aware that EU's and United States patience is coming to an end if we don't start thinking constructively.
So that's I think a good opportunity to then sort of pivot to the next question. One of the specters sort of floating over these negotiations has been the question of the implementation of the Association of Serbian Municipalities. Veton, there's been a lot of pressure on Prime Minister Kurti and on Kosovo's government to implement the ASM, which they had agreed to previously, but then that a constitutional court had raised objections to. How has that pressure played out on the ground in Kosovo? Is the public seeing it as unfair? Is Mr. Kurti thinking about next steps given all of this, and how, if he were to agree and move forward on this, how he might navigate this?
Well, I think there's a general feeling among the Albanian population. I think the latest poll was 2/3 of the population was against forming the Association of Serbian Majority Municipalities. That was something published only yesterday. And there's a general consensus among the Albanian parties that there should not be an association of Serbian municipalities, majority municipalities. Even the parties that actually signed the original agreements in 2013, 2015 have objected and accused Kurti of going to deliver on that. And this creates bad blood, of course, in the negotiating process. And the question is to use a bit of deconstructionism to separate the issues as they are. The first one is it is evident that as part of an agreement, it is a process that should reach its natural end. So if you have signed an agreement, you have to go through that agreement and reach a conclusion that may produce one or the other result, but still a process that needs to reach its natural end. The second is in the draft that we have of the European plan. It is a draft about Serbian self-management in Kosovo. That's the wording that has been used. Self-management and forms of personal cultural autonomy are very distinct throughout Europe, and there are many examples of them. We have, in the former Yugoslavia, had many examples of that as well. And in the process of building the Ahtisaari plan and independent Kosovo, and I was involved in that personally, we have built models of protection of non-majority communities, which is, I think, exemplary to a certain extent in Europe. So the issue now is we have to sit down and work out. I mean, people will be engaged in negotiations, and all of us who can actually support and help in that respect, to find creative ideas in which we address the issues of self-management by the needs. And the needs are always, they keep repeating themselves. It's education, social security, health, issues in which not only identity issues, so issues that need to be addressed for a population that has identified special needs. And this is something that needs to be addressed within this process of negotiations. In the ASMM, the right balance needs to be found between the functionality of the state of Kosovo and the needs of the Serbian population of Kosovo. And added to that, of course, is the question of the Serbian Orthodox Church, which is part of this package that needs to be negotiated. Now, for some reason, this has been identified as an interstate issue, and I'm not quite sure that is wise. It is not a question of Kosovo and Serbia to decide on the Serbian Orthodox Church. Serbia and Kosovo are both secular states. And so it is up actually to Kosovo and the Serbian Orthodox Church to sit and work out an arrangement that is satisfying to the church and to Kosovo.
So I take the point, and I think that is the way forward. I mean, this diplomacy, it's that question of constructive ambiguity also plays a role in finding the creative solutions that actually make a difference and make a material difference on the ground. But Ivan, can you tell me how important is the very call it the brand of the ASM, of the Association of Serbian Majority Municipalities, which has been just a buzzword that has been thrown around so much. How important is that to President Vucic to be able to sell any kind of agreement and deal to the public? Given that there's will be some constructive ambiguities, how important is the branding?
The branding is absolutely crucial, and I would say not only to President Vucic, whichever of our leaders over the past 20 years would find themselves in this position would be confronted with the same issue. Already, Prime Minister Đinđić, whom you mentioned, for whom I worked, first of all, realized that this issue had to be solved as quickly as possible because the non-resolved issue of the relation with Kosovo was an impediment to the advancement of Serbian democracy and thus of EU integration. And he moved as fast as he could on this issue. And he had a number of scenarios in a non-paper that he wrote a couple of weeks before he was assassinated. And so the association has remained a standing point throughout this period, and that's why it was part of the Brussels Agreement in April 2013, and that has not changed. In Đinđić's or someone else's parlance, and I add that Serbia lost a war to which it very unseriously went to with NATO. It was defeated, and during that defeat, it had to leave. The Serbian state, police, army had to leave Kosovo. And so we have been living all together in the region with at least a de facto full independence of Kosovo. And so the point we have reached is the acknowledgement of that reality, and how does one formalize that quote unquote informal situation. And the parlance was, out of the minimum that is left to Serbia, which is the UN Resolution 1244, how can one extract a maximum? And that maximum is the Association of Serbian Municipalities, however it is defined, in whatever shape it takes, whatever functionality or governance structures that it has. And in Europe, as we have beaten to death various examples from Northern Ireland to South Tyrol to the Faroe Islands to you name it, there are solutions on the shelf that can be used. And I think that we're at the point where a number of those solutions have been taken off the shelf and to be adapted to this particular Kosovo-Serbia situation that in many ways is not different than others, but obviously as any unique situation it is. I often like to say that do we want in the region and Serbia and Kosovo to be in a situation like Pakistan and India and have an unresolved Kashmir for the past 70 plus years, or Cyprus, which has a 45-year unresolved issue. And because we're in Europe, because we want to join, this is the time to really, bite the bullet and the compromise, as any, elementary definition says, everyone has to step back from their maximalist goals, and that is the high price of peace. that you abandon what you, in your dreams, you thought was possible, and accept the inevitability of the reality on the ground. And as Veton said in his first intervention, you know, the whole rhetoric has to change. There has to be much more, you know, putting out the hand to the other and realizing that there is a way that we live together. Final point, a statistical point, the municipalities in the north, which are populated more or less fully by Serbs, we're talking nominally about 50,000 people. On a good day, Oliver Ivanovic told me 12 years ago when I asked him, how many people are there in the north, Oliver? He said, well, on a good day, about 30,000.
Cameron, let me just turn to you then, before I turn to Maya. Was as a negotiating tactic, was it wise to foreground this? Obviously, it was a sticking point. It needed to get resolved, but it's so high in the whole sort of the nexus of issues that are being discussed and so publicly kicked back and forth. Was there a different way to do this, or was this the only way, do you think?
I mean, there's always different ways to do this, but I don't think it's something that should be seen as a mistake or ill-advised. This kind of issue in some form, whether it's defined this way or not, is going to have to be confronted. And I think the mention of, strategic ambiguity is the key here to get, however it's defined, however controversially it may be discussed in the press in Pristina or in Belgrade, to get it to the point where people are actually beginning to talk about what it means. And when we say people, we're getting beyond just governmental negotiators. We're getting to the people who live, for example, north of Mitrovica, the people who live in the communities of the south, talking with other people who are experts in such areas as healthcare and education. And you begin to take these issues, once you've got the framework that mentions it, yes, and it's controversial. Once you've agreed you're going to go at it, the key thing here is not simply to say, let's hammer out an agreement. It's bringing people into the process rather than having them say, a priori, I've decided that's a bad thing. You bring them into the process so that they have buy-in to the ultimate, whatever thing is hammered out. I mean, that's why I think it's so important to have the Kosovo Serbs talking, for example, with governmental leaders, the way that the American ambassador in Pristina has arranged in recent days. That kind of dialogue takes this away from the national and international press and puts it on the ground in a pragmatic way. That's no guarantee that they're going to be able to work it out. But I am of the opinion that, yes, addressing this issue in the front, saying, yes, it's a touchy thing, and you have people in the government in Pristina digging in their heels about, no way is this ever going to work. People in Belgrade digging in their heels and saying, oh my God, I'll throw the treason word around. If we are able to get past a framework agreement, the key thing will be that the participants in the framework should not be able to say, as people say in the region, o nas bez nas. That is, it should never be about us without us. Once you bring it down to the level of the communities, in whatever way you define communities and the participants, you have a chance of bringing this back to the real issues that matter. So I'm in that sense, should we get past the framework agreement, I'm optimistic that if it's done correctly with broad participation, you're going to come to some kind of arrangement.
That's actually a terrific segue, because Maya, I know you were at a recent roundtable discussion between civil society groups from Kosovo, both Serbs from the north and young Albanians as well, young people. What was the mood there in that discussion? How are they perceiving this debate in particular?
Yes, Damir, and I love to talk about it. Last week I was in Brezovica at the meeting organized by the New Social Initiative with a group of civil society leaders and members from, yes, young ones from both Albania and Kosovo and Serbia. Maybe not that young, but definitely younger than me. But I have to say, I was so heartened and inspired with this discussion, because that level of understanding responsible thinking, decency, political culture is something that we haven't seen in the public discourse, I would say, for years, and that we terribly need right now. And that's the reason why we are seeing this type of atmosphere. I'm talking about Serbia, but probably it's something similar in Kosovo. Here, actually, the whole discussion is about are you pro-Vucic or against Vucic, instead of talking what this deal really means, not only for Serbia and less for Serbian citizens, but for citizens in the north of Kosovo and in Kosovo, Serbian citizens. So yes, this was a fantastic discussion and open discussion, and they have a way to talk about things even when they do not agree, which is really should be a role model for our political leaders, how they should talk about it. Now, the second point, contrary to some misinterpretations, Serbs from the north want to integrate. That is my impression. They want to integrate because the only alternative to integration is mass migration. There is no third way. And they want to do that, and that leads me to the third point. They feel unheard. Exactly the opposite of what Cameron was saying that should be the case. They feel unheard. They feel they need to talk about practical things that are called normal life, as Vetton mentioned, healthcare, education, what their institutions will look like, how many public servants will they have. They fear that they will be left on their own. That fear is maybe irrational, but irrational is also real when you feel like that, and you can feel that fear among them and insecurity. And yes, they need to be heard. They mentioned to me, they quoted a couple of times Ambassador Hill's sentence, we need to tell these people what their life will look like. That's exactly what they need. And if they were addressed that way, with real willingness to hear their views and to hear their needs, I think on one hand, the negotiators would get a much better understanding of what needs to happen and how much that is, even how much that costs, because I'm not sure that anyone is dealing with that at this moment. So that's what I hope will happen in the next phase.
So, I mean, that looks like there's cause for optimism. I mean, that people aren't being heard, but that there's a desire to be heard. Veton, I saw that one of the things that may come out of tomorrow is again, one of the gestures might be for the Serbs in the north to re-enter government institutions, and that elections in April, Srpska lista may run again. How everything Maya just said, the mood in Kosovo, how ready is society to basically embrace and take the opportunity here to build these kinds of bridges and this kind of rapprochement? If there is movement and a desire to do it.
Well, I don't know if I think so, but I hope so. I hope that once people can realize that there is an opportunity for a dramatic positive change, and that's what rapprochement peace is all about, is stepping into an unknown, because we've known problems and conflicts and unfinished conflicts. What we haven't known is peace. And for a generation that was born in 1999, these are 24-year-olds who have known nothing except tales of conflict, of previous conflict. They have been living in narratives of war. It requires leadership. But that's one issue that has to be addressed. Leadership is insufficient if there isn't a well thought of way of moving forward, and a careful way of moving forward, one that does not, create more stumbling blocks than they already are there. And so I think the most positive outcome from tomorrow is if we can measure that this meeting tomorrow has not created more stumbling blocks than there are already there. Because once you get into implementation, the nature of the discussion is such that people tend to create more problems by necessity, because they think they need to address this and the other issue. And so I think we will measure also the capacity of the mediation effort or the facilitation effort by the quality of documents it will produce. What they have done so far is a welcoming exercise for both Serbia and Kosovo. Both Serbia and Kosovo have entered carefully a path towards normalization. Now, let's see what the next step is.
Let me just ask you a quick follow-up, Veton, before I turn to Ivan with a question from the audience. You mentioned, the role of leadership, and I take your point. It has to be more than just that. But you've known Mr. Kurti for a very long time. Does he have the well? He's a very brave man. I don't want to say does he have the courage, but do you see that he has the will to take that step? Because you're right. While both are required, you still need to take that step, and that is political will. Does he have the political will to do it?
I have no doubt in the fact that Mr. Kurti has the political will to reach an agreement, to move into the next phase, into peace. He's a man of principles, of strong principles. Sometimes very obstinate in demonstrating his adhesion to those principles, and this is something that makes him a very tough negotiator, and this is something that he has demonstrated well. The question, of course, is not how tough can we become, but how tough are we in the ways the leaders are in their ways into actually overcoming some of the less important issues that emerge and moving into the important issues. And so one of the things that have been that Kurti has been attacked on both sides, both in Kosovo and Serbia, is the association of Serbian majority municipalities, whether he accepts or not. That he has already accepted that there is a framework agreement from 2013, 2015, that it is there, it has to be addressed. But he cannot be held accountable neither on that agreement, nor as a way to actually derail a negotiating process over one or the other issues. Both Kosovo and Serbia, let me explain how hard this is in a context of Ukraine. In the whole war of Ukraine, there were in the past year almost 10,000 civilians killed, or something less than 10,000. And that's the number of civilians killed in Kosovo in 1 year. And Ukraine is 30 times bigger. The conflict is immeasurably. In that same period of time, 1,000 kids were killed, both in Kosovo and in Ukraine. And so, imagine getting into a situation in which you cannot deal with issues such as the missing persons for 20-something years. And this hurts Albanians, Serbs, here, there, wherever. If you put one impediment and say, look, I will not negotiate until every single missing person is accounted for. And this is a moral principle. But that doesn't necessarily lead to peace. It is something that should be addressed, ought to be addressed. But if you start from one point and say, this is actually the point on which I will hold the whole process blocked, and with good reason. I mean, if you are close to missing persons families, you understand their pain. They wake up every morning with the thought of their loved ones. So the question of leadership that is required from both sides is to take into account all of these needs and move them to the further goal, and not keep them as blocking stones in the path.
Thank you, Veton. We're getting questions from the audience. Please do keep them coming. Ivan, I have one for you. React to anything Veton has said, but Ambassador Dan Fried, also from the Atlantic Council, asks, does Vucic want to make progress or to play at the process to ward off EU pressure while not actually achieving anything?
Well, thank you for that question, Dan. Let me just say something before I answer the specific question, and it is about leadership, but also historical circumstances. We do have an example, all things being equal, of the North Macedonian Greece reaching the agreement called the Prespa Agreement. These were two leaders, Prime Minister Tsipras and Zaev, who found it in themselves as true statesmen to look over the hill and beyond the mountain and see what was good for these nations against huge majorities in both of their countries against reaching the Prespa Agreement. Hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of both countries waving against this. After 27 years of Greek blockage, nota bene, stopping North Macedonia to become a NATO member and blocking it on its path to EU. So in that sense, fully agreeing with what Cameron and Maya said about civil society and the need to engage citizens, it behooves the leaderships of these countries really to see beyond the top of the mountain and into the next valley and the green pastures. So I think we're beginning, and there have been significant steps. President Vucic, for all sorts of reasons, like the Kosovo side, whether because there were elections in countries, etc., there were stumbling blocks on sitting down. Governments changed, leaders changed. So now we're at that point, and I don't think that there is any more time to stave off or to buy time. Simply the fact that there was this flare-up of possible conflict in December over the famous, car registration plates, where I think it was Ambassador Chris Hill who said, "We've never seen a war begin in the world over car plates," but we came pretty close to violence, which was staved off. So I think that was an additional motivation to the third actor, the international community, exemplified by the EU and the US, to make the additional push on both sides and to move forward. So I think we won't be seeing staving off. And coming back to this issue of working against your majority public opinions, it is because you are in the driving seat as the leader. And the fact that in Serbia's case, very important to mention, to put it very colloquially, Serbia's bread is buttered by the West, by the European Union, by investments from the Germanys and Austrias and Italys and the United States. The job created in the Serbian employment market are practically all Western. And so one has to make a kind of down-to-earth calculation. When people say, are there alternatives to the EU and to making a deal? Well, there are. It's the famous, Albanian approach of 1961, when it broke off from the world, made relations with China and built 30,000 bunkers. But that's the alternative.
I do want to get into the question of sweeteners and what the West needs to do, I think, especially what you're talking about there, Ivan. But we have a few more questions, and I'm looking at them now, try and sort of clump them a bit together. Let me ask you, Maya, in Belgrade, a lot of the questions are, one question is from Platon Petre Claudiu of the National Administration Association about disinformation and Russian disinformation. Other questions from Joanna Gwodziowski saying, what is Russia's role? There's another question about Gordana Delic talking about the role of 200,000 Russians living in Belgrade. I guess let me ask a very broad question. What role do you feel? I mean, Ivan mentioned again sort of the disruptor role of Russia outside. How present is it, do you feel, in media, in sort of public opinions about Russia, and how all of this slots into sort of the broader geopolitics of the moment? Take that any way you want, because the questions are very broad.
Yeah, and the answer is very hard. It is hard to discern, what is actually what is the pure Serbian origin nationalism, and what is inspired by Russian presence and Russian media. One thing I noticed is that the numbers of hours of airtime that Sputnik has on Studio B radio station has doubled recently. And I usually, when I drive a car, I play a game with myself. I turn on Studio B, and then I try to find out how fast can I recognize, is this Radio Sputnik or Radio Free Europe, because they go one after the other. Usually, not more than one sentence is enough. But unfortunately, Sputnik has a lot more airtime. I'm talking just about this one radio station. And when you listen to it, it must be hard for a person, without access to other sources or information, independent media, independent news, or just superficial, for that matter, or old or disinterested, to hear that and not to say, Kosovo is Serbia. We cannot give it up. It's a huge pressure. As I said, that feeling of being a victim that we should not accept. And that's so sad, and that's so scary. And to some people, when I talk to them, when I hear this, and I have to be honest and say I hear this even among my friends living in Belgrade, highly educated, and I said, okay, so how often do you go to Kosovo? Oh, I don't go to Kosovo. I've been there, when I was a kid, when I went to school, I went to excursion. I said, why don't you go and see what life looks like there? And tell me how you feel when you enter Kosovo and enter Pristina. And how do you feel that you're in your own country at that point? Come on, that's just, not the case. And so the other question I ask, and that's a good test, also say if they have children, say, okay, ask your child where he wants to go for this summer, or where he wants to study, or what kind of music he listens to, and then follow his lead. If he takes you to Moscow, go with him. That's good for you, definitely. But I'm not sure that there will be a lot of seats on those planes for Moscow.
Thank you, Maya. A question for you, Cameron. Also, I'm sort of going to clump two of them from the audience. One is from one of our former I'm no longer at the Atlantic Council, one of the Atlantic Council's former young global professionals, Andrea Pozderac, who asks about the future of Kosovo-Serbia relationship and its influence on Bosnia and Herzegovina in particular. We had another question from Birgit Musai, who's asking if the debates about the ASM, what kind of impact will that have for minority groups living in other countries? And again, what the sort of precedent or how that all works for Bosnia. I know that's in the background of a lot, so I figured you might be able to address that.
Well, yeah, we can address it, but it highlights something that's bigger before I turn to Bosnia, which is that we do tend to see this issue as a localized issue. This is something that's, the ASM, these are kind of the agreements here. But the backdrop we're playing against is that eventually, when we start thinking strategically, that we hope the leaders of these two countries are thinking strategically, that it has to do with the broader pan-European developments, that is, the expansion of issues having to do with energy and the north-south axis, the expansion of the relationships that the five non-recognizers are going to have with each other, and indeed not only what transforms within Kosovo and Serbia, what might at a marginal way transform within the EU. What does it mean? What does the solution or the potential solution in the Western Balkans mean for long-term potential solutions for aspirants like Georgia and Ukraine? I mean, these are bigger questions that will come out of these details. Now, the detail for Bosnia is, in my mind, immeasurably more difficult, simply because it's at least my opinion, and I believe it's the sense that you have when you talk to people in Brussels and Washington, that we at least have, we should give Kurti and Vucic, and we should give Lajčák and Escobar credit where credit is due. They're at least at the table. They're at least struggling to say, is there something that's going to work or is it not? We have so much farther to go in Bosnia that to try to figure out what the impact will be at a local level is, to me, it's just hard to imagine. I think what we have to see is if there is a broader regional movement, an impact of a potential agreement, and I'm optimistic, I think, relative maybe to the other panelists. If there's an agreement, it will change the mood. It will change the setting within which the issues like, what do we do about Republika Srpska? If you can get past that kind of fear that Bosnians, that Kosovars have, that, oh no, the ASM is somehow going to create a new kind of RS, these kinds of fears. If you can get past that and start solving problems, this is a model then that gives at least some sense that there is a solution on the ground and indeed an international context within which these kinds of problems can be solved. So I would urge people thinking about Bosnia to think less about specific links between this particular set of discussions and what happens in Bosnia and the general context of how things change if there is progress, what that allows for Bosnia in the longer term.
We're coming up to the end of this hour, so I taking both Cameron, your cue there, and what Ivan said, Veton, let me turn to you about obviously next steps. We've talked about the importance of the international community, the West, and what they can do to facilitate the solutions that hit people on the ground. But we're talking about the path forward. There's been reporting that UN membership for Kosovo may not be on the table, or at least needs to go before the 5 at the Security Council. But nevertheless, there needs to be a path forward for Kosovo into European institutions, perhaps into NATO. And there you have the question of non-recognizers. So give us a sense of what you are looking for that you think will be necessary as sort of sweeteners. What can be delivered, what will be promised, what can be promised, and where all this needs to go in the next steps.
Well, let me put 3 broader contexts. The first one is that the issue of Kosovo-Serbia has emerged now in a more serious fashion because of the Russian aggression on Ukraine. And so it became a geopolitical issue. So Kosovo and Serbia are seen within the greater context of stabilizing Europe as such. If it is a geopolitical Zeitenwende, as it was called by the German chancellor, then you have to deal with it as a geopolitical issue. So if it is a negotiation about geopolitics, it is about having Kosovo and Serbia deeply entrenched within the West, within Europe. And that means, in Kosovo's case, that means NATO. And that means a faster European integration. Now, faster European integration means nothing since Ivan mentioned Thessaloniki in 2003. It is, you can give faster integration in a perspective, but that's not measurable. So the question is not even do the countries as such get faster integrations, but do the countries as such, the Western Balkan 6, have an incentive to actually move in 2 ways, in creating the 4 liberties, 4 European freedoms within the region, and how fast that can be integrated, those freedoms within the European space. And there are ways to do it, both in terms of financially and institutionally. And so that needs to be dealt with. And the third is, if this is going to be serious business, it has to be serious business. And that does not mean kicking the can and saying we will integrate this agreement into Chapter 35 of the Serbian negotiating process, because that's an additional issue to all the other chapters that Serbia needs to deal with, and it is not inviting for neither side to move, or say Kosovo, this will be part of your stabilization and association process. That doesn't mean anything. That is simply integrating it into the European bureaucracy. So there's a internal conflict, conceptual conflict between Zeitenwende on the one side, and then getting into this Chapter 35 and SAA stuff. You need to find totally different language for a totally different context, because this is a geopolitical unique opportunity to actually use that big crisis in the East into moving the post-Yugoslav space, if you will, into the heart of Europe.
I couldn't agree more. And I mean, this is one of my personal hobby horses. Ivan, you and I have talked about it a lot, about the future of European enlargement and whether this moment, this geopolitical moment, will in fact constitute a Zeitenwende in the thinking. React a little bit to what Veton said there. Do you feel like it is lining up? I know there's been progress in talking about what these procedures are, different paths that will accelerate it. Partial integration, moving forth locally as we move the other direction. We haven't spoken in a while. What's your take right now? Where do we stand on that?
Well, indeed. I mean, this is an eminently geopolitical moment, like the one of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. This has changed everything. The Russian aggression has changed everything. The world is different. It's put on its head. The architecture of European security is changed. And so this question falls into, as Veton was saying, into a bigger framework. And so, leaving the Serbia and Kosovo side, the Europeans have to think about security, and do they allow the space for Russians to be a spoiler? I mean, the Russians know well, they look at the map as the rest of us, and they know that this belongs to the West, but they cherish the moment to show the weakness of Europe and of NATO by being the spoilers that they are. Secondly, the fact that if as we kind of cautiously expect, there will be progress, if not tomorrow, then in the weeks that follow, because Gabriel Escobar has talked about reaching an agreement by the end of the year. We, as a tiny region of 6 countries, and we're about 16 million with all the demographic kind of tragedy that is happening, we are a system of communicating vessels. So if there's something positive like Prespa or hopefully Serbia, Kosovo, that will impinge on Bosnia as well. There will be a relaxation of the atmosphere, and maybe we'll be able then to move forward. And again, reconciliation acknowledging the crimes that were done in the name of our countries is extremely important, and especially missing persons is the kind of first important step in that direction. So yes, I think there is a sharpening of minds with everything that happened. That's why we are at the point of this important meeting that will happen tomorrow.
Cameron, let me turn to you. Maybe press you a little bit about the non-recognizers. There's a lot of behind the scenes talk. I know whenever I talk to people from the region, I'm trying to figure out the intel of where these things stand. Obviously, it's all hearsay unless you're in the room. What's your impression? Where do we look on that for the non-recognizers? Because it seems like that's one of the really big issues that could help unlock Kosovo's path right now after this negotiation. You're muted again, Cameron.
Yeah. I'll be very brief. Also, I can only speculate about this. I've been out of the American government, thus out of these discussions for more than a decade. But I believe this has not been a handle that the Americans or the Europeans have used as much as they could. That is to say, I would welcome more overt discussion about just why it is that the 5 non-recognizers remain in this position. And everyone looks in the room and you see there is, Mr. Borrell from a non-recognizer, and here's Mr. Lajčák from a non-recognizer. There are contradictions that show themselves up. I don't know the details on the inside, but I would certainly welcome, and I think many would, a very robust discussion with the 5 non-recognizers about why they find the need to be this, and why shouldn't they be more engaged in trying to find solutions.
Maya, I'm going to give the last word to you as we wrap up here. Honestly, I came into here expecting a more deflationary, sort of pessimistic and nervous session. I'm walking away much more optimistic. How's it look for you? What are you expecting next steps and maybe tomorrow?
I want to say that I'm really an optimist this time, and I'm optimist because I hope that the leaders participating in this discussion with the huge support of international community, that they're capable of raising up to the expectations and really going beyond their daily political ratings and looking into the legacy in the years ahead. And I think that is possible. It's just a moment that when you have to realize, when you can touch the history happening around you. And I think this is that moment. And this is, in that sense, it is that opportunity to really write the history, because history is written by the people and for the people, not by the piece of land, for the piece of land. So that's what really gives me hope in this moment, that they will raise to the occasion and do the right thing. Nothing will be resolved tomorrow, but made important steps with commitment to hear each other's concerns and to put the people in the middle of their discussions.
Well, thank you very much, Maya, and thank you very much to our panelists. This was a wonderful discussion. Thanks to all of you joining us outside. Sorry we didn't get to all of your questions. Really encourage you to, if you care about the Western Balkans and follow these issues, do follow my former colleagues at the Atlantic Council. Their AC Europe account on Twitter is a great resource, and I hope you will join them for future events like this. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.